Hello, I am Chris Sylvius. Welcome to a short seminar on transitional fossils. This will be a discussion or a determination on whether or not the appearance of transitional fossils is evidence of creation or evolution. So let me share the screen and we'll get started. So we begin with the Eusthenopteron, which is basically upper or lower Devonian or upper Ordovician, I'm not sure, probably Devonian. And then the Ichthyostega is the upper Devonian, which has 8 digits and extended fins. So you start out with a fish on the bottom, and then it evolves into a partially land-dwelling creature at the top, basically. In the span of about 23 million years, going from the Eusthenopteron 4 died 385 million years ago to the Ichthyostega 362 million years ago. That's about 23 million years of evolution, going from fish with fins and gills to a creature that has extended fins with even digits attached to them and even lung features that enable it to partially live on land. Now, this circumstantial evidence, okay, showing an increasing complexity from the primitive organisms to the most complex, and then similarities in the gene code and the DNA in general. This is circumstantial evidence to suggest that one evolved into the other, but direct observation, meaning one kind of animal changing into another, has never been observed in the history of the world or in any modern, experiment. Despite the advances in 2022 of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, there has never been a major change produced in the laboratory. So, evolving from a fish to the Ichthyostega, which is technically still a fish, is not possible because of the major changes that would have to be overcome. And the only way to solve this is the circumstantial evidence and deep time, but there is no direct observational evidence. The appearance of transitional forms, though, is evident. Is it transitional or not is really the question, but you have a fin on, in the bottom layers belonging to the Eusthenopteron, and then you have the 8 digits hind limb, okay, on the Ichthyostega, but in between is the Tiktaalik, probably the most famous transitional fossil that there is, and it has a transitional foot-like feature in between the fin and the hind limb. And so is this a transition, or could this be a design? My claim will be this is a design. Okay, so the appearance of transitions is actually a pure coincidence based on various ecosystems that are relative to their altitude above sea level. So the Ichthyostega is living at a higher altitude than the Eusthenopteron, which is why they've been found in that order. God created a tree of life from the least complex organisms living on the bottom of the ocean and the most complex living living high up in the mountains, or at least on the land. Very high above sea level is where you'd find the land-dwelling mammals. And so this was a tree of life that you can find in any phylogenetic chart, which they will claim is evidence of common ancestry, but in fact it is proof of an intelligently designed tree of life. And since Genesis 1, which says over 10 times in the first chapter that animals will bring forth after their kind, has never, there's never been an exception to this ever. This is the general observation, basically making it a scientific law that one kind of animal cannot change into another, and the evolutionists would say that if we could prove one kind of animal could change into another, that would actually disprove evolution, because you wouldn't expect to happen in a short period of time, which is obvious. Okay, one kind of animal is not going to produce another one just within a generation or two. Okay, it would take millions of years, but we can replicate millions of years in the laboratory with organisms such as bacteria, which have extremely rapid reproduction rates. Okay, they some of them, grow up and have babies and then die all within 20 minutes. So millions of generations of bacteria can be produced, and it has been. They've been producing bacteria and producing many species of bacteria. It's been over 100-year study, including with animals like fruit flies. But fruit flies, just like bacteria, they refuse to become anything other than fruit flies in any human experiment ever devised. And so what we know is that animals stay the same. There is a order that we find the fossils in, from least to most complex. We have the Cambrian organisms, or the Precambrian, which is single cells. The Cambrian are insects and plants that are on the bottom of the ocean floor, and then you progress to fish, amphibian, reptile, and mammal. The amphibian, just naturally, as with all of the features that it has, is naturally in appearance a transition between the reptile and the fish, and the mammal would be naturally a transition between the reptile and the bird. And so just because they appear transitional, that does not necessarily mean they evolved, because if this order of complexity was actually designed and these organisms were placed instantly in various ecosystems by a creator, then this tree of life, this phylogenetic chart, and the natural order of fossils as they are in the in the fossil record, this is evidence of a design. Genetic similarities also prove a common designer. Okay, he used the same tools for various purposes in different organisms. The entire geologic column would form again if you were to flood the whole world with just soft silica infused mud starting from the ocean floor. So if you introduced concrete agents into or cementing agents into mud, and then you buried the earth in that, starting from the ocean floors and then progressively burying the earth in mud all the way to the top of the mountains, the you'd find the animals that died in that rapid burial. Just if you could do this hypothetically, they would be in the same order as you find them in the fossil record today, from the fish at the bottom to the mammals at the top, and there would be exceptions, but the general observation would be that when animals are catastrophically buried by a global flood, they end up in this order. Second call to logic is that transitional forms are alive today. Now, evolutionists need to think logically about what they're saying, that these animals evolved when, if you just look at it logically, if you take a closer look at it instead of just coming to the first conclusion that you see, you'll understand that it is the evidence for common ancestry is actually not as compelling as evidence for design. It's more logical to believe that these animals were designed. Transitional forms are alive today. You have the mud skipper on the right, and he spends part of his time in the water and on the land. It has, it's technically still a fish. I think it has gills, but at least the ichthyostega, this creature at the bottom here with the digits, it lives in the shore and in swamps. There are animals like it today, just like the mud skipper, and it lives in swampy areas. So it's in, the transition is in relation to its altitude above sea level. The animals that live, in the shoreline or in the swamps in between the land and the water are going to have features, you know, that will enable them to live in that ecosystem. It doesn't mean that they're a transition. They have been designed to fit in different ecosystems, and those ecosystems change in complexity in relation to their to the altitude above sea level. The basal characteristics that are common today, in such as the amphibians, which share characteristics between the fish and the reptiles, these basal characteristics, they are common today, and most of them are directly related to their altitude above sea level. Even the animals that are alive today, such as reptilian mammals that live in tropical forests, and amphibious reptiles rather, that live in swamps, and amphibious fish, which live close to the shoreline. These would all be found in this order. If you could hypothetically, bury the earth in mud today, they would end up in that order because that's where they live. Reptiles by themselves are transitional between amphibians and mammals. This is just a natural appearance, and so because one kind of animal cannot change into another, and because of that there's only circumstantial evidence to support the idea that they evolved, it would seem that they were in fact created. There are mass extinctions in between each major group of animal. The fish, amphibian, reptile, and mammal. The Ordovician and the Devonian would represent the fishes. Okay, and then there's an extinction in here where there is a complete absence of fossils. So, in between the Ordovician creatures, which mostly plants and insects, and some fish that live close to the ocean floor, and then the all the major body plans for fish that are in the Devonian. Well, the transitional forms you would expect to see, in the middle, are actually absent, and the same thing in between fish and amphibians. There's an extinction in between the amphibians and the dinosaurs, which would be this Permian Triassic mass extinction. There is an absence of fossils. So in the exact place you would expect to find, transitional forms, you have all these extinctions, and so that is an absence of fossils. The reason there's an absence of fossils is because when a mass extinction happens to, a group of creatures like all of the amphibians or the reptiles, for instance, like the dinosaurs over here in the Triassic and the KT extinction, it's going to reduce that population of dinosaurs dramatically. And so when that happens, that's how you're going to get a graveyard of fossils. And then for millions of years, as the population reboots, if you will, you're not going to get any fossils because there's not a mass extinction to quickly bury it and preserve it. And there really isn't enough of them. Today, fossilization is extremely rare if it occurs at all. You need rapid burial, you need some kind of mass extinction to accumulate a graveyard of fossils, such as are being found by paleontologists. And when you find a fossil in the ground, that's what you find it with, is an entire graveyard. So that's what the mass extinctions are. But the mass extinctions, reveal a vacancy of fossils in the layers of strata that are in between major groups of animals. So they call them missing links because they literally are missing from the fossil record. You look in between the Cretaceous and the Jurassic, and there is a vacancy of fossils in between the Jurassic and the Triassic, the Permian, and the Devonian. Vacancy of fossils, and this is so there are no transitional fossils. All there is what appears to be transitional forms at the at the tops of these so-called eras, like the Triassic. At the bottom of the Triassic strata, you'll have one kind of reptile, and at the top you can find another kind of reptile which appears to be, evolved from the creature that is on the bottom. But again, is this transitional or is it actually evidence of design? Here's a fifth call to logic. Okay, so if you think that the fossil record, represents evolution, you need to consider the fact that at least 90% of the entire fossil record consists of aquatic animals without a backbone, mostly clams and shells, and only about 9% represents land animals, and less than 1% of that consists of reptiles or mammals. So, most of the fossil record is marine organisms. It's a marine deposit because there was a global flood that primarily affected the animals living in the ocean. Because the water, that's coming down for the first 40 days and 40 nights is eroding the pre-flood mountains, which were much smaller than today, bringing all of that mud and dirt into the oceans, as well as some other factors, like the fountains of the Great Deep, which is uh, the earth rupturing. Okay, like the seam wrapping around a baseball, the earth basically opened up and popped like a balloon, with most of the water that we see on the surface of the earth today under the crust of the earth, and with that it brought up a lot of dirt and mud, which covered the earth in mud progressively until it all covered the pre-flood mountains. And basically the pre-flood mountains were completely scoured and then established into geologic layers because of phenomena like liquefaction and hydrologic sorting. But the point is that it's not logical to assume that these fossils evolved, but rather it's more logical to assume that there was a global flood because the land-dwelling animals that are represented on the fossil record virtually don't even exist, relatively speaking. It appears to be a marine deposit. The textbook jigsaw puzzle of the geologic column, it's 100 miles thick in the textbooks, but in reality, the thickest naturally existing column is less than 20 feet, and most are less than 2 miles thick. So the deep time in this is, you know, a glaring contradiction to what we actually see. The geologic column is a misrepresentation of transitional forms because, relatively speaking, reptiles and mammals virtually do not exist. And the geologic column is a misrepresentation of deep time because the natural sedimentary rock columns are dramatically condensed. So all the layers of strata that you need to represent deep time are not even there in the first place. Similar features at the tips and bases of geologic strata containing fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals are a designed feature. Fossil graveyards are evidence of mass extinction and rapid burial. The standard geologic column is built by a superposition of local strata from many different localities. That would even conventional wisdom suggest this. The thickness of strata is determined by the amount of erosion coursing through any given geographical location. So, you know, in, for instance, the North Dakota geologic column, you would have the fish at the bottom, and they would still be evolving into the amphibians, but because more erosion is taking place in that spot than maybe another spot, well then all the strata that would all of the strata that would represent deep time is being eroded away, and then the next animal begins to evolve, and then erosion takes away that earth, and then the next animal evolved. Okay, so because the earth is constantly being eroded, that's why you don't have a complete column on the earth. But if that's the case and all that erosion has taken place, then how can you really trust these radioactive elements, and how can you assume that these processes have always been the same and that erosion, has not occurred catastrophically, which they would agree that catastrophic erosion has taken place, but they want to separate it into different time periods over the overall course of millions of years, when In order to do that, you need to put together the geologic column like a jigsaw puzzle in the textbooks and establish a theoretical model for how this is possible, when it's more logical to believe that it was a global flood and that it was one single mass extinction rather than a collection of them over millions of years. The A natural complete column does not exist because of the fact that it is a chart used to explain local catastrophism or ecological zonation, and that is exactly what the Bible teaches, except it was not, again, scattered events, it was one single event. And early geology was catastrophist. Okay, before evolution began to be pushed in the textbooks. They had to actually fight in the courts to get their theories into the textbooks, because before it was strictly intelligent design and geology was explained by catastrophism. Um, so yeah, that was replaced by uniformitarianism, the idea that the way things are happening now is the way they've always been happening, by long, slow, gradual processes, and so the key to the present is the past. And because of a lack of workers, money, and resources by the early creationists, they lost the battle to the evolutionists. And not only did the theories of evolution get pushed into the science curriculum of public schools, but creation was slowly uh, removed and suppressed. And a paradigm, cannot shift in the scientific community without a political connection with workers, with money, with resources. And so, if you lack in those, it's very unlikely that the paradigm will shift. Even though paradigms can shift in the scientific community, I think that they are limited to how much workers, money, and resources that you have, which the creationists lack very much. So that is a problem. Now, Dr. Grady McMurtry said that if people truly understood what evolution theory teaches, absolutely nobody would believe it. And Dr. Kent Hovind said that evolution theory is a dying religion surviving on tax dollars alone. If you truly understood what the geologic column is, I don't think that there's any reason you should believe that it's evidence of common ancestry. Okay, if you truly understand what transitional fossils are, there's no reason to believe that they were not created. Dr. Colin Patterson he's a senior paleontologist of the British Museum of Natural History in 1988. He said that I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly include them. I will lay on the line there is not one such fossil. So even this guy says that these things don't exist. And in fact, if you look in the fossil record, the exact place where they should exist is represented by a vacancy of fossils called a mass extinction. And so they're called missing links because they, in fact, do not exist. All you have is what appears to be transitional forms at the tips of these time periods or layers of strata, but because they're the same kind of animal, there's no reason to believe one evolved into the other. One's just living at a higher altitude above sea level than the other, and so they have features that are more land capable than the features of an animal that lives closer to the ocean floor. And so it's a pure coincidence based on the ecological zonation of the pre-flood world in relation to the animals living above sea level. And then the genetic similarities, for instance, in between the apes and the humans, is a pure coincidence based on an intelligent designer. It's not evidence that they are related to a common ancestor, but rather that they were created by a common designer. So that concludes this part of, or that concludes this short seminar on transitional fossils. They were created, and they did not evolve. There is no evidence to suggest that they evolved, there is evidence, but it doesn't have a high level of confidence in in comparison to the flood model. The flood model offers a more logical and reasonable explanation. If you find a fossil in the dirt, uh, obviously it died, and if you find a graveyard of fossils, well, then many of them died all at once. They're all over the world. Um, it's just very obvious that it was a global flood, and because there's no evidence of one animal changing into another, it's obvious that they were designed. So, thank you so much for tuning in, and God bless America.